What's up, everyone? Welcome back to your favorite New York Jets subscription podcast, Badlands. I'm your host, Joe Caporoso, joined, not as always, by a different Connor, Connor Hughes, back on the show, I think fourth or fifth time. Always great to have him on. SNY's own. Connor, how you doing, my friend? We're almost at the end of what has been quite a season. How you doing?
I'm doing well, buddy. I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on again. It's always a blast to talk ball with you.
So I'm going to dive right into the general manager, and we'll talk a little bit about the head coach. What would you say is the most fair criticism you regularly hear of Joe Douglas based on what you've seen in his tenure and what you know from what's actually transpired behind the scenes?
So when Mike McCagnon was this team's general manager and you looked at the moves that he made, you questioned a lot of them for the why and the reasoning behind it. You know, whether it was drafting another 34 defensive end in the first round, when it was Leonard Williams, when you already had Mo Wilkerson and Sheldon Richardson, it was Quinnen Williams when you already had Leonard Williams, and Mo might have been gone at that point, but still, or Henry Anderson was there. So it was Henry Anderson and Leonard Williams, and then you take Quinnen Williams, who ended up being a hell of a player, but still, it was like the thought process, the signing of Le'Veon Bell, the signing of, or I shouldn't say the problem in signing C.J. Mosley, but the amount of money that they gave C.J. Mosley. It was always, I felt, flawed thinking. And that's one of the reasons why this roster was so doomed under McCagnon. With Joe Douglas, I don't think that's necessarily happened. When you look at the moves that he's made, the theory feels like it was always right. You know what I mean? Like the offensive line. We all want to rip apart the offensive line. Yeah, the offensive line stinks and the players aren't that good. But when you look at the players that are here, it's not for a lack of resources. Laken Tomlinson, a major free agent signing. The Jets had previously signed Morgan Moses, George Fant specifically, another big signing. Billy Turner, a guy they signed to be their swing tackle. The draft picks that are in there, Mekhi Becton, first round pick. Carter Warren, fourth round pick. Max Mitchell, fourth round pick. Mekhi Becton, first round pick. Joe Tippmann, second round pick. I mean, Elijah Vera Tucker, first round pick. There have been so many resources invested into building the offensive line. It just hasn't worked out. Same thing with receiver. Denzel Mims, a second round pick. Garrett Wilson, first round pick. Elijah Moore, second round pick. Free agent signings. Corey Davis, big signing. Alan Lazard. I mean, he's put his financial resources and draft resources in the right places. It just hasn't been the right players selected with them. So I think the one thing that you can criticize him for is just picking the wrong players, but not necessarily the positions or the players that he targeted. He just didn't take the right guys, if that makes any sense. I think that's probably the most fair criticism of him.
I feel like one thing that's a little under discussed, and maybe it's not actually true in practice and just true on paper, by the structure the Jets set up, Robert Saleh reports to Joe Douglas, and Joe Douglas ultimately was very involved, if not made the final call in hiring Robert Saleh. So part of what goes on Douglas's resume is he hired the coaching staff and he manages the coaching staff. It's not that he just picks the roster. And certainly Robert Saleh deserves all the criticism he's got. His record speaks for itself at 17-33, and we'll talk about him a bit more after this. But is that accurate from your understanding of how the Jets organization actually works? That like Douglas hired Saleh and Douglas manages the coaching staff and he has the purview to make changes there, because for a long time, Jet fans always complained the GM and the head coach don't have a direct reporting line. They both report to the owner. This is never going to work. The Jets were very public in saying that Joe Douglas is the top football guy in the organization. He manages the coaching staff too. And yet I feel like that's almost never discussed. They're kind of discussed independently, whereas if you have an issue with Saleh, it's also kind of an issue with Douglas because Douglas hired him.
No, that's actually the one thing is that a lot of times when you have a new regime take over, Joe, and you see this, you can always kind of finger point to the last regime, right? This guy did this guy did that. This entire roster, management, everything, it is Joe Douglas's baby. Christopher Johnson essentially gave him all the power. Now, when they were hiring Robert Saleh, Jaime was involved in the interview process. Christopher Johnson was obviously involved in the interview process. Woody Johnson got involved in the interview process, but it was more Christopher Johnson. But I remember reporting at the time that this was Joe Douglas's show. And when Christopher Johnson held his post-mortem press conference after the team fired Adam Gase, he said that this is going to be Joe Douglas's show. He's gonna listen to other people, but this is his baby. And when you look at this roster, there's but 2 or 3 guys who were leftovers from the Mike Maccagnan regime or the Mike Maccagnan era, and Quinnen Williams, surprisingly one of them, and he's the team's best player. But the coaching staff, that is the coaching staff that Robert Saleh pieced together, but Joe Douglas hired Robert Saleh. The entire roster is players that were handpicked by Joe Douglas, which goes back to the original criticism. It's not for lack of trying. It's not that the resources have been invested in the wrong places. They just have been the wrong players selected, if that makes sense. I mean, think about when Mekhi Becton was there. How much different does this offensive line look if they take Tristan Wirfs instead of Mekhi Becton? How much different does this offensive line look if they choose to invest and commit to Morgan Moses long-term, who's had a heck of a career since he's left with the Jets? It's just little things like that have held the Jets back. Even this draft class. I mean, think about what this receiving unit looks like, or what the long-term future of this receiving unit looks like if the Jets don't take another pass rusher who's playing 10 snaps a game for them right now, and instead take that draft pick and they use it on Jordan Addison, or they use it on Zay Flowers, or even JSN, who's come on as of late there as the number 3 option in Seattle. I mean, again, that's what it's, and I've gone back and forth and I've argued with people within the Jets building about this, because they'll say, look, we don't have a backup quarterback right now. That's why, we're falling, is that we lost Aaron Rodgers and the whole thing fell apart. The offensive line stinks. That's why we're not able to do anything on offense. And they're right. The backup quarterback is a major problem. Losing Aaron Rodgers was a major problem, but they didn't turn to some slap what to play the rest of this season out. They turned to a guy that this regime selected second overall. Their offensive line right now, yes, you are right. They are completely injury depleted. But when you look at the players that are out there right now, you have a left tackle that this regime selected in the first round, a left guard that this regime paid a ton of money to, a center who this regime drafted in the second round, right guard. Yeah, there's issues there. But even at right tackle, Carter Warren has to play because Billy Turner, the player that this regime drafted, be their swing tackle, a player in a swing tackle that's supposed to fill in these situations, can't play in Billy Turner. So it's tough because, yes, the excuses on why they're struggling are valid, but the reasons why they're struggling, you almost can't excuse this regime, because they are the guys, and it starts at the top with Joe Douglas, who hand-selected all of these players.
I don't find it surprising, ultimately, that they're keeping Saleh and Douglas. It seemed like that was where this was headed from the second Rodgers got hurt, for better or worse. Yeah. I think as a fan, probably the best you can hope for at this point is that there's some changes made to what I refer to as their inner circle. And with Saleh, does that mean they change play callers? Does that mean they make some changes to the offensive staff? It almost feels insane to bring back the offensive staff for one of the worst offenses in NFL history. We know there's some complexity there, though, with Aaron Rodgers and how his opinion weighs on this. And then with Douglas, you look at a guy like Rex Hogan, who's kind of like been here and bounced around through a few regimes, and some of the other guys that are close around him. Is there any world where there are some meaningful changes? And I would think meaningful would have to be sort of like the assistant GM or the head of pro personnel or the offensive coordinator, or at least the offensive line coach, where it seems to be some problems there from past players and even from current players liking things on Twitter, criticizing him. What's the most senior that there's an actual chance of there being meaningful change this offseason?
I don't know if there's going to be anything. And I know Joe Douglas, certainly he's not going to fire Chad Alexander or Rex Hogan. I mean, they are his left and right hand men. I mean, I'll be honest. This is me speculating. I have not dug on this. I haven't, even, I'll be honest with you, I haven't even thought to check in to see like, hey, could you fire these two guys? I do believe that Joe Douglas is going to go down with this ship, that if this thing fails and he's fired next year, he's not going to start firing the people that he trusts in any way, shape, or just from knowing Joe Douglas over these years. I would be floored if he started firing these people just because they're close, and where it's like, we're going to see this through, and if we lose, we're going to lose together, but I'm not going to scapegoat these guys around me. For Robert Saleh, it would probably make sense for him to move on from Nathaniel Hackett. Obviously is coming back, so then you'd look to Todd Downing, right? He would be the one in jeopardy of losing his job. Keith Carter, certainly. That offensive line has been abysmal, and I don't want to hear about the injuries, because you look at what Callahan's doing in Cleveland. That line is just as banged up, and he still has that group performing at an extremely high level. So coaching does matter. But here's the thing, Joe. When the Jets moved on from Mike LaFleur, which was not a Robert Saleh decision. So right now, when Robert Saleh is coming out and saying, I'm not making any staff changes, I'm keeping my staff, I believe that's what he intends to do unless someone from up above, potentially ownership, steps in like they did with Mike LaFleur and says, look, I want this guy out of here. Then obviously Robert Saleh has no choice but to let the guys go like he did with LaFleur. But when you look at potentially Keith Carter being let go or Todd Downing being let go, I know that these were two men that Robert Saleh personally slammed the table to bring in. You know, we can talk about Nathaniel Hackett, that the reason why he's this team's offensive coordinator is because, yeah, the Jets wanted someone who had done it before. But let's be honest with ourselves, that everyone and their uncle knew that getting Nathaniel Hackett meant a direct line to Aaron Rodgers, and the Jets wanted Aaron Rodgers. Basically, every quarterback plan they had was thrown out the window once they thought that this guy was a legitimate possibility. And once they found out that he was a legitimate possibility, it became, all right, let's do whatever we can to get him. But Keith Carter and Todd Downing, these were two guys that Saleh wanted well before Rodgers became an idea, well before Hackett became an idea. In fact, there was a plan out there that it was going to be Mike LaFleur as the offensive coordinator, Todd Downing filling that Greg Knapp role, and then Keith Carter coming in as the offensive line coach. That was one iteration of the alternate reality of what the Jets look like with Derek Carr running the show. I don't personally see unless ownership steps in or Joe steps in and says like Douglas steps in and says like these guys need to go, I find it hard to see Robert Saleh letting those two guys go strictly because, again, he slammed the table to bring them in. I mean, they were priority marquee signings. It would be the equivalent of when the Jets, I know it didn't work out because injuries, but when the Jets signed Carl Lawson, it was like, wow, they went and got their pass rusher. From a coaching, filling out the coaching roster standpoint, that's how the Jets viewed these two guys. So to just give up on them after another year, it probably wouldn't bode well with the way that this team is rounding out this staff. But I will say that at this point, Joe, it's almost like, I agree with you. I think that when you have a historically bad offense and you just run it on back, it's like, what the hell are you doing? But from their perspective and from ownership's perspective, at least when I checked in on this before the Washington game, the standpoint was, we invested all these resources for you guys to see this thing through with Aaron Rodgers. We're going to give you the opportunity to see this through with Aaron Rodgers as you are presently constructed, with obviously this offseason adding the offensive line pieces, adding another receiver for Garrett Wilson, but they're going to let you see it through. Those would be the two moves if they're going to make one. But again, I struggle to see that actually happening.